Dude, it is like dark outside, by the way. Like this is like nighttime lighting. There's no light. It's just cold and rain outside. It's crazy.
Speaking of nighttime, it sure is dark how these statistics are being interpreted. So, anyways, Nick linked me on Discord here just a bunch of different statistics that keep coming out from, I would say, reputable news companies. But the fact of the matter is that the way that we interpret tests, one is wrong. The way the graphs are actually created are misinterpreted. But perhaps more problematic, our investment in education policy and reform tends to be centered on these tests. And what we wanted to do was just dive into what is this quote unquote crisis that's occurring with test scores around the country, whether it be the ACT, national history test scores, reading scores, whatever. What has been the response to that? But then also deconstruct, what is there a crisis at all, and what should we be paying attention to instead?
Well, I think there is a really interesting phenomenon happening where there is this learning loss narrative that is out there, and the more data comes out that shows that obviously there has been an impact as a result of the pandemic, it gets fed through the lens of this narrative, but it's not enough to put it in its full context. It's not enough just to show the data as it is. To be properly filtered through the learning loss narrative means that it has to be catastrophic. And what you're seeing here,
we have
like
a whole resource on that. That's
yes,
like a whole thing we wrote up that's like pretty in depth.
Yes, what you're seeing with this Axios,
and it's
headline,
like crazy.
What you're seeing with this Axios headline is the class of 2023 had the worst ACT performance in more than 3 decades. If you were just to isolate that out of context and just say, whoa, like, holy moly, maybe that's a cause for some kind of, elevated concern. And perhaps it is, right? But let's bring in the full context.
Look at that drop.
Look at the drop in the graph. If you were just to ignore it, you say, oh my gosh, scores are down about half.
So what we want to do is using very elementary, I'm no Google Sheets expert, but I know how to make a graph in Google Sheets. I can do that much. So what I did was I took the exact data that's used in this chart. I went to the ACT website. I found the same exact statistics from 1990, or I guess I got from 2014. My bad. But I went on ACT. I found the 2014 data, the 2023 data. So I mapped it down to a closer x-axis variable. Right. I took the national median score, like they did on here, the ACT composite score, and I mapped it. And this 2014 to 2022 bit is what's happening right here on the graph. It's this segment right here, this big drop. But if you take it based off the score of the ACT, which goes from 0 or maybe 1, to be fair, I don't know if you can actually get a 0, but that's 0 to 36, which is the top score.
Right.
Well, this is the catastrophe right here.
It looks like since 2020, when the average was a 20.6, to 2023, a 1 point drop over 3 years. So a 1, that would be about a 2.7% decline in scores over the course of 3 years. I don't know. Like, again, if you situate it in a different context, you begin to see how manipulatable the narrative and the data set kind of are connected there, right? They're connected by the hype to be able to fulfill the learning loss narrative.
Hey there, Camera 2 editing Chris here, just letting you know that in the time that we were recording this video, the tweet that Nick sent about this graphing situation went viral. And as a result, it got like a bunch of retweets, and a lot of people were responding with this very similar thread of saying something like, if you map the Earth's ocean temperature on a 0 to whatever scale, then you're saying that 1 degree doesn't matter. And just to make sure that no one's confused on the difference here, if we're saying the Earth's ocean temperature has remained the same for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, a 1 degree difference actually does make a very big difference. And we've seen the impact of that in the real world. Climate change is real. That's not what we're trying to get at here. Instead, these test scores have barely changed over time, and they fluctuated up and down in that same time period that we're declaring this catastrophe. It matters that we situate the context of what this graph is meant to show and how people are going about narrating it or describing it. All right, back to the video.
This one was actually shared with me by a follower, a donor of ours. And it was literature that was given to their spouse, who happens to be a teacher at a school. So this was part of a paper, like a little PD paper that was put together by some school committee about the importance of keeping cell phones away from study areas or something, right? You hear about all the time, like, you know, your proximity to your phone is going to interrupt your attention, and that's going to have an impact on these test scores. The report card grade, represented by the y-axis, starts at 80% to the maximum of 84%. So 1, 2, 3, 4% is the entirety of this y-axis.
Right. So full disclosure, I couldn't find the original report. I could for all of the other ones. So I'm just guesstimating based off of the graph what these numbers are. But it's relative, right? It should be close enough. And you can see here, if we just take this data and plot it onto a bar graph in the context of a 0 to 100 report card, from a certain glance is like, I guess it's different. There's an irony to me that specifically in the ACT one, but just school generally, probably the most asked question on a math standardized test is being able to interpret graphs and diagrams. You do it in social studies as well. And they typically ask you questions that relate to having disproportionate X and Y axes to demonstrate how you can mislead people with facts, lies, and statistics type deal, right? Let's do the next one.
So this one is another interesting one. There's been a lot of I forget who would call it this, but misnapery, in the sense of like this tremendous misuse and misrepresentation of these NAEP scores. The National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card, right? It's the thing that we're going to use to figure out whether our kids are learning or not. So let's consider the graph crimes at play here again, starting the y-axis, at 200 and scaling it up to 24 to just kind of establish the range of scores here. So again, if we were to extend that out, we would find a much more flattened horizon. Considering the context and the scope, you really have to get into some misleading use of these statistics to make the declines look as bad.
It's not the only issue, because look at the y-axis on this chart. It goes from 0 to 200 to 230 to 500. So it's a 0 to 500 chart. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to go on. So what's kind of nice is that the nation's report card actually has this thing where you can generate the data. Like it just,
they have all of it.
It's really nice. And it's really easy to use. So what I have here is, I don't know if this is the same data that was in that tweet, but we'll just use this as an example. This is the 4th grade reading data from 1992 through 2022, because those all use the same framework.
30 years of data
made in 1992. So it's a pretty good chunk of data. What I have here, I just took the data from the NAEP website. And as I understand it, the NAEP data, if you look at this here, goes from 0 to 500 on a scale. So the data goes from 0 to 500. This one zooms in at 200 to 230. And this is what NAEP data looks like over time from 1992 through 2022. Full disclosure, I got rid of, in apparently like 1998 and 2000, there were 2 different scores taken, but they were like 216 versus 270. I don't know why, but just to make the graph work. And it's worth noting too, the way that you actually get this score, the way the NAEP works is you're taking an adaptive test where students will answer questions until the system determines that they got they kind of like reached their point of learning. So like you keep getting questions right, you keep taking the test longer and longer. If you get a few wrong, it'll start giving you easier questions, and it tries to solidify you at a certain point, and that's your score based off number of right versus number of wrong. So the difference from 214 to 217 is literally like 1, maybe 2 questions. So the difference from 1992 from 2022 is the exact same. And the best we ever did was in 2015. We got one, maybe two questions more right on the test on average. But then that quickly went back down and it quickly went back up back here. Like it's all so meaningless.
I think what we're seeing is a little bit more of that shock doctrine to say, here are voucher pushers, privatizers using the pandemic as the shock to the system to justify all of these market-driven changes, which, you can look at the data around vouchers, that it's pretty clear that they don't work to do the things that they're proposing they do, but they work in the sense that they move a public system more towards a private one. So that's ultimately their end goal.
The way at which this finds itself is through reports like this. In our learning loss handbook, we frequently talk about McKinsey. Graphics on screen here about what McKinsey does. But McKinsey put out, I believe, 4 or 5 different reports about learning loss, and they're still publishing more. And one of the most, I guess, infamous ones to me was this loss of learning leads to loss of earning, in which they claim that due to, right here, that we're looking at, due to that chart, we're going to have a future in which people earn, what is it, like $40 billion less in the economy, I believe. In other words, if I get one question less on a test on average, the economy is going to lose out on 3% of its GDP, which, given all of the other things we're going to look at, first off, makes no sense, but it also allows companies to capitalize on that report. This is a report from the 74 million, which has some like problematic takes about like unions and market-driven economies, etc. Where this research report claims that it's going to take $700 billion to fix learning loss, which is in part due to like hiring in-person tutors, supporting summer school programs. The United States government has invested billions upon billions of dollars into schools to incorporate COVID relief in the form of addressing learning loss. All of that money being thrown at this chart. And it's not like schools don't need additional funding. They do, but they need to be funded in different ways. There need to be more, that funding could be better allocated to not just improving test scores. There are other things that we should be focused on.
The issue is really that we aren't addressing these issues until they get to the schoolhouse door. And then we're saying that these problems that originate outside of school, we're going to address with school-based interventions. So we're going to say we're going to overcome the poverty gap, not by addressing poverty, but by implementing this particular reading program provided by McGraw-Hill at the cost of, this $20 million contract to the district that's going to, again, have some marginal boost in reading scores or whatever. And of course, like all that stuff matters. But really what you're getting at, Chris, is like these are all just excuses to not address the systemic problems. Like the failure of COVID in the United States was really was a national failure. It wasn't a failure of schools. It was a failure of the system.
Right. It's also just not fair to schools generally or fair to teachers to claim that education is going to solve those inequities or policy problems, because the way that you solve inequality in society is not through educating people better. It's by using policy to eliminate poverty, to eliminate the inequality that existed in the first place. This book I have up on the screen here by John Marsh is an incredible, well-researched document that dives into literally the subtitle, Why We Can't Teach or Learn Our Way Out of Inequality. I would make the argument that the reason why schools, let's say in Finland, tend to do so well on the PISA, that tend to do so well generally on test scores, isn't necessarily because their schools are incredible, although they do make a lot of really strong pedagogical practices and claims. But it's because they basically have no one who's homeless. There's more of a social safety net. We're not saying that pedagogical changes don't need to happen. It's just that the response to changes like this of test scores over time is to go back to basics and center really dehumanizing practices on kids because of the narrative that we need to solve society through education, as opposed to looking at other statistics like engagement rates or how students feel, like literally like their social emotional health, and trying to address that in schools, which could make a more flourishing, purposeful society that is going to require pedagogical shifts. So in addition to that, the other inequality graph, I did want to pull up A couple other stats that you were kind of referring to, Nick. This is showcasing the rising inequality gap between the top 10%, 51st and 90th percentiles, and the bottom 50%. So this little tiny black line across the bottom, the really dark shade of purple, that's the bottom 50% of the population in the United States. This 51 to 90th percent is the next step up. And then this massive light purple section, that's the top 10% of earners. And you can see that over time, especially in the last, I don't know, about 20 years-ish, that gap is getting even worse. The bottom 50th percentile has basically nothing.
Probably gotten worse since 2013. That was 10 years ago. I think the pandemic maybe exacerbated some of those things too.
Speaking of, this one's from 2016. This one is highlighting the racial component of the wealth gap. So if we just compare those two graphics right away, you can see that the economic gap between white and black families has basically remained the same for the last 30 years. That even when you account for black families 25 percentiles higher in terms of their income, they still are only halfway to the 50th percentile for white families. What I'm trying to get at by showcasing the other graphs that are well done is that when you compare this to this, you question, why are we investing billions upon billions of dollars into this testing industry and getting kids to learn more on tests when the same exact organizations are the ones that fund stuff that fix this? Like, it just seems completely counterintuitive.
When Axios publishes a graph like they have with the ACT scores, what graph aren't they publishing that also tells a story of, educational inequities, right? That's really, if that's really what that graph is about, or if it's supposed to represent just some amorphous concept of learning loss, well, we know that, sort by zip code, sort by, racial demographics, sort by all of these things. It's going to fall out the same because it's all connected to household income. It's all connected to, these wealth gaps. Education is not going to be the thing that's going to close these gaps. Not to say education is not important, very important, but again, we're reversing cause and effect here. We could do a lot by fixing these issues first and seeing the results in our scores instead of vice versa.
Let's round it out with three more. As anyone who's under the age of like 40 probably knows, or if you're a parent or a guardian, you know this from your own kids, the cost of things generally is going up, but specifically college prices and rent prices are at an all-time high. Here's a chart. Again, it's showcasing a percentage change. You can see this like whitish green. That is the inflation rate. So adjusted for inflation, as prices should go up over time. The college tuition inflation, as it's gone up over time, is this dark green. The average college tuition and fees have increased by 1,200% since 1980, while inflation is only up 236%.
And what's wild is you don't have to get involved in graph trickery to make this case, right? It's indexed to 1980.
It is what it is.
You can concretely see the increase charted out there.
One more, just to make people feel bad, but you could also look at this in terms of median rent versus median household income. The way this works is that it's indexed to the price of 1960, as in this is a percent. It's calculating for inflation. In other words, the green line at the bottom, that is real household income. But the price of rent, this top red line here, has increased to the point that we're at like roughly right now, roughly 20, this is 2014. So it's gotten worse. Again, the statistics are always hard to find. But 2014, it's like 165%. So rent is 65% higher than it used to be, but people are only making 20% more.
If you recall, in 2021, the government basically just said like, hey, we're going to give you an advance on your child tax credit. So you get a tax credit anyway for having kids. I forget the amount. It changed pretty recently. And they were like, we're going to give you an advance on this. Okay. So you basically get a UBI for having your kids. So your income by default goes up $200 to $400 a month. Okay. Which is a lot, especially if you're like a middle low income family. Maybe I think it phased out at higher incomes or whatever, but like if you just look at the policy results of that, it's been studied now, and they've found that the child tax credit expansions were the expanded child tax credit reduced child poverty enormously. So these are the number of children lifted out of poverty by each measure. We virtually eliminated child poverty with this one cool trick. Libertarians hate when you eliminate poverty with this one cool trick, which is called give people money. The headlines now are not just that, oh, hey, we can look back and understand the impact that the child tax credit had on lowering poverty. Now we're seeing increases in child poverty that would have not been in poverty had we just kept that same policy going. We stopped the expanded child tax credit policy for no reason. So, right, we can see here, in 2021, we had about 4 million kids in poverty.
Yeah.
In 2022, 9 million under the Rescue Plan child tax credit.
It still would have gone up slightly according to their data. But still, that's 3 million people that have made their lives better as a result of a policy that should universally benefit people, because if people don't live in poverty, that also means, for example, their test scores will go up. Which
Right.
I'm not saying that test scores are a valid metric of learning, but if we're concerned about test scores,
Yes.
that's how you're going to do it.
Yes. Whoa, what is this?
Yeah, here's, this is a statistic. I wanted to bring up the fact that it proves that if you're richer, you tend to do better on state testing. And all this shows is, so this is using NAEP data. The poorer districts here on the left, the ones in blue, these are poorer districts, tend to be behind the national average when it comes to like your grade level on reading and writing and math and that kind of thing. But as you get to richer districts, it's a direct correlation. I mean, look at how many data sets are on this thing, that as you increase income levels, oh, hey, look, people are doing better on the test.
And let's throw in knowing what we know, keep it on this graph, but knowing what we know about how socioeconomic status cuts across racial lines in the United States in particular, right? We know that probably those school districts and those kids that are up in that green quadrant there are probably going to be whiter than the kids and the school districts that are in that bottom left quadrant down there. So, right, our accountability systems of education in the United States also just say like, oh, the white wealthy school districts must be doing well. We're not going to pay so much attention to them, whatever, but we're going to punish with these accountability measures these poorer non-white districts, as we even saw with our look at what Houston ISD is doing with the takeover of the district down there, right? We have one language of understanding poverty, and that's punishment. And then we carry over that same language to education to say like, oh, if we make impoverishment miserable enough, then people are going to want to get out of it more. And we know that that's not how that kind of thing works. So basically, the gist is that the educational measures that we're looking at, okay, we have to weigh their relative importance, but also just take them with a grain of salt. Just knowing that ACT results are, constructed by a testing company. We don't really have a sense of what an increase or decrease, as marginal as they are, really means in the grand scheme of things. What does it mean to decline 1 point over 5 years or go up a point over a number of years? Is that actually meaningful, impactful? But pretty much just view this data through a critical lens, and of course, be a critical, skeptical consumer of information and data, especially as it tries to attach correlations, causation, cause and effect to these kinds of things. Of course, the pandemic was an incredibly disruptive event. That doesn't mean we can draw cause and effect from one particular intervention or action to the changes that we're seeing in the data points, because there's a lot more underlying it than just school-based interventions.
Right. So instead of focusing on test scores in this graph that we're looking at right here, we probably should be focusing on the much more important statistics of mental health, of purpose finding, of child engagement rates and boredom, and focusing on alleviating those issues, which is kind of the whole point of our organization, I guess, at large.
Thanks for watching. Remember to like, share, subscribe. If there's any other data sets you'd like to have us take a look at, or if you're interested in letting us unpack anything, let us know in the comments. Thanks.